Hi everybody. As Nicola has covered, the moment we shifted to emergency remote teaching, we've moved into a very different space, um, where our teaching has been impacted heavily by our social context, and that same influence and impact will be seen in our assessment. And as I'm sure that in the various departments, there have been many long debates around what assessment should look like, what it ought to look like, etc. So here we've got six very important things to think about when we think about our assessment, especially in this remote phase that we are in. So number one is we need to think of in terms of our assessment as a varieties. So we should try and allow for a mix of assessments. Um, the CHE and everybody has been saying that we need to think of our assessment more in terms of continuous assessment. Um, and we have been in conversation with various lecturers all over our institution. Um, and I think those with the best assessment design would cater for these various for a variety of assessment types. And what I mean by this is we need to maybe examine what are we doing. Um, for instance, one of our colleagues in accounting has actually modeled his assessment techniques right from the onset, and he's been very smart in that way. So what he's been doing is he's been giving his students weekly um, assignments, um, and at the moment it doesn't count marks, so it's purely formative. So students have been socialized into this weekly assignment that they had a week to do. He would release it on a Monday. They'd have to submit it by a Friday. Now, traditionally in his class, that would be done in one session on a Friday. So in one form of tutorial, the students would walk in, they'd get this problem, they'd provide the solution, and then they would leave. So as I say, this lecturer has been modeling this week by week, and once he shifts into um, higher stakes formative or summative assessment, the plan is actually to still keep to that structure, but only release the assessment on a Friday morning and with the expectation that students will submit it come Friday afternoon. Um, but again, this is going to be all about a debate because will one day be enough? Will it enable all of our students or all the students in that class to actually complete that assessment? Um, similarly, I've had um, got discussions with other colleagues who have approached assessment in different ways, and they've shifted to open book assessments. Um, which is, I think, a fundamental rethink. Um, and what we mean by the open book is we would normally have a semester test that would be invigilated by tutors or by the lecturers themselves. We would still keep that same type of assessment, and what I'm saying is we're keeping that same type. We're not keeping it exactly the same. Um, and actually transforming that into a week-long exercise, or in some cases even longer. Um, but the key comes in how we approach this type of assessment and how we use technology to get that. Another important idea that we have to keep in mind is that we need to ensure clarity and focus. So, and what we need to remember here is if we don't communicate clearly what we expect from our students, especially in the space we are operating in now. the process is not forgiving. So students cannot just pop you an email or put up their hand and say, "Sir, ma'am, Dr. Prof, I don't understand what you are saying." So we need to carefully plan our assessment, and actually roll it out in the same way. And that's why I'm going to refer to our colleague in accounting that has modeled his behavior from all the formative assessments right through to his summative. So there's going to be no surprise for the students. Number three, and I think this is probably the most important one, and where we're really going to struggle to align our assessment practices, is that we need to allow for different types of submission. So I'm going to talk again about our colleague in accounting. Um, the students would normally, well, under pre-remote, pre-lockdown, um, these students would be able to walk into a class. They could submit a handwritten document. In some cases, they could submit it on Excel if they so choose. Um, and here I think he's played it very well. He's given the students the option to decide what they want to use. He accepts any form of document or image. And I think that's going to become very important. And especially when we think about our assessment, we have to design with that in mind. Um, Number four is we need to also clarify our expectations and assessment criteria. And this is going to be super, super, super important. As I was saying, and it links to number two, where if we're not clear and we're not focused, and we don't clearly specify our expectations and the assessment criteria, it leaves students in a space of ambiguity. So I think back on the example that you did, I think 2 weeks ago, where you wrote that test. So keep that in mind. Any assumption that we have about what students are, they surely should know that, then we should surely be communicating that as well. Keep that as a mantra. Then a very sticky one, and I think this is a complex one for a lot of our colleagues, is that we have to determine, our time allocations. And we have to think about constraints, as Nicola has pointed out. Not all of our students will be able to complete all of our assessments on a computer. Not all of them would have a quiet space to sit and focus on purely that assessment. Some of our students would be getting up at midnight, um, completely wrecking their sleeping patterns just to complete our assessment. Some might have to walk a lot of kilometers to actually submit our assessments or to even get them. So we have to think about that, and we also have to think about how we plan the time that we're going to allocate. Um, what other universities have been doing around this that are a bit further down the teaching journey, they've been converting all of their normal assessments into multiple choice um, style of assessments, which has got its strength and some weaknesses that we have to be cognizant about. But what I think they really did well is they've actually relooked at timing. So if I would ask 2 essay questions in an exam, and I would give students 2 or 3 hours to complete them, they actually converted that into days. But they also had to rethink the type of questions, and I'll talk more about that in our next slide. In ways in which we can transform our questions, especially for the online context that we are working in. And number six, and I think number six is probably the biggest fear that all of our lecturers have, is how do I prevent cheating and how do I prevent plagiarism? And I think there's not a real easy solution to this. I think if I had the easy solution, I'd be sitting on my own island somewhere, sipping cocktails. So I'll give you the reality. The reality is, there are ways in which we can design our assessment to prevent cheating. When we think, oh, but open book tests or exams can be so superficial and easily to Google answers, we can design our questions so that becomes a bit more difficult. And the same with plagiarism. You'll see on the course page, I've created some examples. We can incorporate Turnitin into our assessment. Turnitin has been activated on the assignment, so we can actually check for similarity. But again, it's something we have to communicate to our students. Okay, so I'm just popping this Bloom's taxonomy up, and I think you might have encountered this once or twice in our teaching careers. And the only reason why I've popped this up, and I'm not going to talk too much about it, is when we design our questions and even all of our assessments, we must always remember or give some form of guiding principle. And my approach to it is to say when we look at the lower parts of the pyramid, understand and remember the moment we test for that, we will most probably have questions that are Googleable, all right? So multiple choice questions that ask for definitions and those type of deals. So students will be able to quite easily Google an answer. But the moment we ask for apply, analyze, evaluate, and create type of questions, then that becomes significantly more difficult for students to actually move into that next space. So I would always keep this in mind, and that's why I say when we look back to the previous slide, when we think about our time allocations, when we think about our expectations, if we think about our learning outcomes, how do we translate this into questions that are going to measure that higher order thinking? All right, it's going to require students to engage. And the moment we ask those type of questions, and depending on how we depending on our own context and even our disciplinary context and our course context, we are able to do away with time limits. And I'm not saying we should throw it away forever, but for the moment we might have to be a bit more flexible around time and actually aim for questions that are aimed at the apply, analyze, evaluate, or create level. If we go to the course page of Catalyst, we'll also see you'll also see some examples. And if you go down to our session on emergency remote teaching, you'll see that there are a couple of examples. Just go have a look at the quiz. In this quiz, we've actually used it as a form of gamification. We've left you some breadcrumbs. Just have a look at what we described the scenario in the label. You can click through it. Nothing counts marks, obviously. The same with the assignment. It's just a case scenario and how we've dealt with that, as well as a Turnitin for exams. Again, these are not exhaustive examples. There are so many that we can think of. Okay, for a bit more detailed stuff, if anybody is not on the course yet, we've got a resource page called Are You Teaching Online? And on that specifically, we've got a little section on how do I conduct assessment. We will be rolling out a couple of more sessions on assessment in future. So if you haven't signed up, please sign up. The link is on the Catalyst course page. Then I just want to point you to this resource. I think it's a very useful resource. It's called the Blended Learning Resources, where they discuss online assessment and how we can transform and design assessment that's suitable for the online space. I think it's a very useful space to go into. It you'll walk away with some real tools. We've also had Anneli Mankis who did a session with us on online assessment. We'll also put the link on the course page. It was really a great session that provided us with a lot of food for thought and also gave some really excellent examples. Thank you so much.